Convenience. We want to thank you for joining our Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer webinar. Today's webinar is on clinical trials with Dr. David Ilson. I am Britt Aaron, Programs Director for Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer, and I will be moderating today's webinar. We would like to thank our sponsors, Genentech, Lilly Oncology, Merck, Taiho Oncology, and Astellas for providing funding to make this webinar possible. You will be able to ask questions during this presentation. You can type your question into the questions section that appears in the webinar menu. We will address questions at the conclusion of the presentation as time allows. In addition, the recording of this webinar will be accessible on our website in the lecture library. First, I will share information about stomach cancer and Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer. Then we will hear a presentation on clinical trials with Dr. David Ilson. The presentation will be followed by a question and answer section if the time allows. In 2018, it was estimated that more than 26,000 Americans would be diagnosed with stomach cancer and more than 11,000 would die. Most patients are diagnosed at stage 4 when the 5-year survival rate is only 5% and the incidence rates in younger populations has increased. Yet, many know very little about this deadly disease and little research is being done. Pictured here is the founder of Debbie's Dream Foundation. Debbie was diagnosed with stage 4 stomach cancer in April of 2008. She had no risk factors for stomach cancer and her symptoms were very vague. At the time, she was told that her chance of being alive in 5 years was only 4%. She endured harsh chemo regimens and targeted treatments and experienced many recurrences over 9.5 years. Unfortunately, Debbie passed away on December 23, 2017, at the age of 50. She dedicated herself to helping others with stomach cancer by raising awareness and providing resources and education. Debbie founded DDF in April of 2009. As an organization, we are a member of several advocacy coalitions, including the Deadliest Cancer Coalition, the Patient Equal Access Coalition, the State Patient Equal Access Coalition, and One Voice Against Cancer. Debbie served for many years as a patient advocate on numerous committees and task forces. As an organization, DDF will continue her important work and legacy. Debbie's Dream Foundation is dedicated to advancing funding for stomach cancer research, raising awareness about stomach cancer, and providing education and support internationally to patients, families, and caregivers. Our ultimate goal is to make the cure for stomach cancer a reality. You can learn more by visiting our website at www.debbiesdream.org. In a few short years, DDF has achieved many great milestones. We have 29 chapters across the U.S., as well as chapters in Canada and Germany, and events are ongoing around the country. Our patient resource and education program helps patients, their families, and caregivers around the world by matching them with survivors and caregivers by using disease-specific criteria, including stage, biomarker, and location. We host educational webinars such as these, symposia year-round, and our website contains an in-depth information about stomach cancer that can be translated into more than 60 languages. We also have provided $1 million in research grants to date and advocate each year during our Stomach Cancer Capitol Hill Advocacy Day to add stomach cancer to the Department of Defense's peer-reviewed cancer research program. We will be returning to Washington, D.C. next February to maintain funding for researchers. These efforts have resulted in funding for nearly $18 million being awarded to stomach cancer researchers over 3 fiscal years. Please consider joining us February of 2020 in Washington. More information can be found on our website under the heading Take Action. This is a current snapshot of our website's homepage with links to numerous resources. Here you can see some of our upcoming events, such as our annual Night of Laughter in New York, our next symposium at Dana-Farber, our Dream Big Oceanside Bruncheon in Fort Lauderdale, our North Carolina Golf Tournament, our International Symposium in Weston, Florida, our next webinar on nutrition and eating through the holidays, our annual golf tournament in Fort Lauderdale, as well as our last webinar for the year on precision medicine. DDF is headquartered in Plantation, Florida. Our office hours are Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Also on the side are the important phone numbers and email addresses you can use to contact our office and staff, and of course, this information is also on our website. like to introduce Dr. David Ilson. Dr. David Ilson is an attending physician and member at Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York and is a professor of medicine at Cornell Medical College. He is a nationally recognized authority in the treatment of gastrointestinal cancer, whose primary area of research interest involves upper gastrointestinal cancer with a special focus on esophageal cancer. Much of his research has focused on the study of new agents in advanced esophageal cancer and the evaluation of novel agents in combined modality therapy programs in the locally advanced disease. Dr. Ilson's other areas of clinical expertise include gastric, colorectal, esophageal, pancreatic, and other GI cancers. Dr. Ilson has been the chair of DDF's Scientific and Medical Advisory Board from 2016 to current. We would like to thank Dr. Ilson for presenting on the latest in clinical trials and for all of his hard work and dedication to the field. Dr. Ilson, we will now turn the presentation over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. The focus today is going to be an update of recent clinical trial research, a limited discussion about some advances in surgical management of gastric cancer, and we'll talk about some pivotal results of recent clinical trials and new drugs. And I'll mention in this context some of the ongoing studies of new agents. Next slide. These are my disclosures with industry. These are largely consulting and advisory capacity committees. Next slide. So I've included this slide to put in perspective how common stomach cancer is around the world and its incidence in the United States and North America. And you can see this is a disease that's more common in men than women. And the leading areas of incidence in the world are really East Asia, South America, and Eastern Europe. You can see relatively low down on the list, which I've circled there, is North America, where gastric cancer is a relatively uncommon cause of cancer. And for that reason, it makes it difficult to do large screening programs, and it makes early detection of this cancer difficult. Next slide. So I just want to talk briefly about the surgical management of stomach cancer, because for patients with localized disease, it is clear that adding other therapies to surgery improves overall survival compared to surgery alone. The most common approach now in the United States is the second approach that I've listed, which is chemotherapy before and after surgery. So pre and post-operative chemotherapy around the time of surgery, usually given without radiation. This approach was previously using a chemotherapy regimen called ECF, which is a 3-drug chemotherapy regimen of a platinum drug, 5-FU, and epirubicin. And this resulted in adding this chemotherapy to surgery results in about a 25% reduction in the risk of recurrence of the cancer. Now, however, the ECF treatment has been replaced by a chemotherapy regimen called FLOT. This was from a German trial, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And we'll talk about FLOT chemotherapy, which also is a 5-FU drug, a platinum agent, oxaliplatin, and a third drug, Taxanes or docetaxel. The top option that I have on the list is post-surgery radiation plus chemotherapy. Now, as I said, typically we give chemotherapy before surgery, do surgery, and then follow additional chemotherapy without radiation. This is an older approach where patients got upfront surgery, and there was benefit for a combination of chemotherapy and radiation after surgery. However, the problem with this approach is this is really a benefit for patients that have had less aggressive surgery. The optimal surgery at the time of removing a stomach cancer is what we call a D2 resection. That really amounts to a larger number of lymph nodes taken. Most of the patients that were treated on this early trial had very few lymph nodes taken out at the time of surgery, and in that situation, radiation added a benefit. The more contemporary approach of giving chemotherapy before and after surgery also included patients that had better quality surgery, more lymph nodes taken, and in that situation, radiation did not add a benefit. And then lastly, I'll just mention the approach in Asia. Remember, I told you East Asia is the most common place where stomach cancer is present. Also, patients get screened for stomach cancer in Japan and Korea, and often are found at an earlier stage. The approach in Asia is to do upfront surgery, and then patients typically get 6 months to a year of chemotherapy after surgery, again without radiation. Next slide. So I just want to comment on the FLOT regimen because this is the new standard of care for chemotherapy given before and after surgery. This was a large German trial treating over 700 patients with localized stomach cancers. And again, the old standard of care, if you look to the right of the slide, the previous standard of care was the ECF chemotherapy regimen given before and after surgery. And the newer treatment was the FLOT regimen given for 2 months of treatment before surgery, and then 2 additional months of chemotherapy after surgery. Next slide. The FLOT regimen is a modification of FOLFOX, which is 5-FU plus oxaliplatin, and it adds a third chemotherapy drug dose of Taxol administered every 2 weeks. Next slide. So this trial was positive on all fronts, showing a better outcome for the FLOT regimen compared to ECF. And you can see these are what we call progression-free survival curves. These are patients, what is the incidence of patients being free of cancer? And the red line shows that the FLOT-treated patients, So this, can we go back? You skipped the slide. Please go back. So this is patients who are cancer. This is the correct slide. Please stay on this slide. So this is a chart showing patients that are free of cancer in long-term follow-up. And the red line is the patients that received the FLOT treatment. The blue line is the ECF. And you can see that there's a higher proportion of patients that were free of cancer in follow-up that got the FLOT treatment compared to ECF. Next slide. And this is the overall survival benefit where you again see an improvement comparing the red line versus the blue line. This translated into almost a 10% greater chance of being alive at 5 years compared to the older treatment. So with improvements in survival, and there also were better responses to chemotherapy with the FLOT regimen, this is the new standard globally for patients that are going to go for gastric cancer surgery. Preoperative chemotherapy with FLOT followed by surgery. Next slide. Again, as I said earlier, radiation therapy has not been shown to add a benefit. This is a trial from Asia. The reason I mention this is because a follow-up on this trial, data were recently presented at the ASCO meeting a few months ago. So does radiation therapy add to very good quality surgery? These are patients that had good quality surgery. And again, in Asia, patients get surgery first and then 6 months of chemotherapy. And this was a trial assigning patients after surgery to 6 months of chemotherapy versus chemotherapy plus radiation. Next slide. And here you can see no survival difference in this Korean study. So if you do good initial surgery and you get chemotherapy after surgery, adding radiation translates into no survival difference. You can see that there's no difference in these two lines of patient outcome, whether or not they got radiation. Next slide. So this trial was followed up in Korea because their first trial did suggest that maybe patients that had lymph node positive stomach cancers, if they had lymph node involvement in their cancers, maybe they would benefit from radiation. So the Koreans conducted a follow-up study focusing only on lymph node positive stomach cancer. Most of the patients had stage 3 disease. And again, they got upfront surgery, D2, good quality gastrectomy, and then patients were assigned to get chemotherapy alone or chemotherapy plus radiation. Next slide. This just shows the treatment assignment. There were actually 2 different chemotherapies looked at on this trial. One was 6 months of a 5-FU drug and oxaliplatin. Another arm got a year of 5-FU. and then another arm got 2-drug chemotherapy plus radiation. So chemotherapy alone or chemotherapy plus radiation. Next slide. And if we focus on that right-sided panel, that looks at the patients that got chemotherapy alone or chemotherapy plus radiation. This is a disease-free survival curve, patients that were free of cancer. And you can see that adding radiation did not increase the likelihood of a patient being free of cancer. So yet another study that shows that as long as you do good quality surgery and get chemotherapy in the context of surgery, adding radiation does not add a benefit. Next slide. So should patients still get radiation after they get stomach cancer surgery? Well, in stomach cancer, it's really the quality and the extent of the surgery that dictates the need for radiation. If we don't do good quality surgery, so if patients don't have enough lymph nodes taken, there are higher rates of local recurrence of the cancer. There's a higher risk of the cancer coming back locally in the stomach, and this is why radiation therapy improves outcome. However, for stomach cancer patients that get very good quality surgery, a D2 resection, the use of chemotherapy alone is adequate treatment. You don't need to get radiation. And again, the approach in the West is flat chemotherapy before and after surgery. The approach in Asia is upfront surgery followed by 6 months of chemotherapy. Next slide. So I'm going to focus the rest of the lecture on talking about advanced stage 4 stomach cancer. I always include this slide in my lectures because, what is the correct chemotherapy that we should give patients that have stage 4 chemotherapy? If we look at the very center of this table and we look at FLO, which is the FOLFOX or FOLFIRI, those are 2-drug chemotherapies. And these are large trials that treated patients with metastatic stomach cancer. And the second line looks at the response to chemotherapy, the percentage of patients that responded to chemotherapy. And if we look across the line of the percent response rate, you can see that all of these different treatments achieve very similar remission rates. It's about 40%. And you can see, if we look in the center of the table, 2-drug chemotherapies like FOLFOX and FOLFIRI have very similar responses, about 40%, compared to the very right side of the table. We look at DCF and ECF, the 3-drug chemotherapies. They also show responses in about 30 or 40% of patients. So it's really not clear whether more than 2 drugs chemotherapy is better. Adding a 3rd drug may not add a benefit in metastatic or advanced stomach cancer. And then if we look at the survival numbers, they're modest, but the point is, if we look at overall survival across this table, it's not really different whether patients get 2 or 3 drugs. And average survival time now is about a year, but we always have to remember the average means that half of patients do better than a year. But my point from this slide is that there's not really a significant difference in how patients do, whether they get 2 chemotherapy drugs or 3 chemotherapy drugs. Next slide. So how should we treat each patient that we see in our office with stomach cancer? Well, we really have to individualize treatment to every patient. We have to assess the patient's age, how they're feeling, their medical issues. And for the vast majority of patients with stomach cancer, a combination of chemotherapy drugs is preferred over single chemotherapy drugs. And again, 2-drug chemotherapy treatment is preferred. And in the United States now, the regimen of FOLFOX, which is 5-FU through imidacloprid plus oxaliplatin, is the most common chemotherapy given to patients. Less commonly used is 5-FU irinotecan or FOLFIRI, and then some patients, the oncologist will use oral 5-FU using capecitabine in combination with oxaliplatin. The 3-drug chemotherapies, this is where we add docetaxel or Taxatere. This is a much more toxic treatment with a lot more side effects, and sometimes older patients with more significant medical issues will not tolerate this. So typically we may consider this more aggressive, more toxic treatment in younger patients without medical issues that maybe have a better tolerance of this type of treatment. Also, we tend to give these more aggressive, more harsh treatments in patients that have more symptoms, because they may give a little bit higher response. So if we have a lot of symptoms from the cancer, perhaps we want to be a little more aggressive with the chemotherapy up front. And obviously, it's a quality of life issue. When the treatment has more side effects, we have to discuss with our patients whether they're willing to tolerate more side effects for more intensive treatment for what may or may not be additional benefit. Next slide. So I always like to show studies and clinical trials that support how we select treatment for patients. And this was a very important trial from Japan. It was actually just published a month or two ago in one of the Lancet oncology journals. This was a trial in Japan asking the question in advanced stage 4 stomach cancer: is there a difference with 2 chemotherapy drugs? And this study used S1, which is an oral 5-FU drug, oral 5-FU plus cisplatin, with or without the addition of docetaxel, versus 2 chemotherapy drugs in advanced stomach cancer. This was a trial in over 700 patients treated in Japan. Next slide. And this looks at the overall survival achieved. And the point I want to make here is there's no difference whether patients receive 2 chemotherapy drugs or 3 chemotherapy drugs. There was no difference in outcome. Also, no difference in response to chemotherapy, no difference in time on treatment. So yet more evidence that sometimes less may be more with treating stage 4 stomach cancer. Next slide. So when we move to the second line of chemotherapy, again, FOLFOX, 5-FU oxaliplatin is the standard first-line treatment. The backup chemotherapy is typically either Taxol or Taxotere or Irinotecan. And I've included these slides. Again, these are survival curves. And the upper curves, the blue and the red curves, both show superior survival outcome compared to just medical care. So it's much better to give chemotherapy second line with either Taxol, Irinotecan, or Taxotere compared to just medical care. So second line chemotherapy does improve patients' outcome in stomach cancer. Next slide. Now we have a new chemotherapy drug approved for stomach cancer in patients that have a tumor that is resistant to FOLFOX, resistant to Taxol and Irinotecan. We have now seen recent approval of the drug TAS-102. TAS-102 is a novel oral chemotherapy drug combined with another drug that makes it allows you the ability to absorb the drug by taking it by mouth without having to get it intravenously. TAS-102 has already been approved in colon cancer in patients who are resistant to conventional chemotherapy. And this was a randomized trial in patients that had received previous chemotherapy, either 2 or 3 previous chemotherapy regimens. And because beyond 2 or 3 chemotherapy regimens, there's not a good standard treatment option, patients were assigned to treatment with TAS-102 versus really just supportive medical care. Next slide. And we can see again, this is a survival curve. The red line are patients who received TAS-102, achieved a superior survival compared to patients just getting medical care. Although the improvement in survival was modest at a median of only about 2 to 3 months, this translated into about a 30% reduction in the risk of death from the cancer in the short term. So this drug improved survival. And if we look at the next slide, also progression of the cancer was improved. Again, the red line is patients getting TAS-102, and the lower line is supportive care. And this is time to the cancer progressing. So obviously, it looks like initially many patients didn't benefit from this treatment, but then there is an improvement beyond 2 or 3 months, suggesting that this drug can stabilize the cancer and may potentially modestly prolong a patient's lifetime. So based on this, TAS-102 is now approved as a 3rd or 4th line chemotherapy drug to treat advanced stomach cancer. So a new drug that was just approved earlier this year for stomach cancer. Next slide. So I want to focus now in the last remaining slides on genomic profiling of cancers as well as immunotherapy trials. It is now common for pretty much all of our patients with stage 4 stomach cancer to take the tissue biopsies and perform genomic sequencing, or what we call next generation sequencing, to identify mutations and genes and abnormalities in the cancer that may direct treatment or identify clinical trials for new drugs. So there are 4 categories of genomic subtypes in stomach cancer. The most common is patients that are called genomically unstable. That's 50% of stomach cancers. The genomic findings are usually we usually find what's called a p53 mutation, which we don't really have drugs for. However, these patients have amplification of the genes that are involved with receptor-associated tyrosine kinases. A good example of a receptor-associated tyrosine kinase is the HER2 or Herceptin targeted pathway. So it's important to do this study to identify patients that may be HER2 positive or have other pathways that we might have drugs for to treat. Another important subset is patients have what's called microsatellite instability. These are patients that have a high mutation burden in the cancer, but more importantly, as we'll see in the next slide, these patients may be sensitive to immunotherapy drugs. About 20% of patients have what we call genomically stable tumors. These are classically the more diffuse gastric cancers, and these have very few mutations and abnormalities and currently no clear pathways that we have drugs for. And then lastly, another important subset of patients, particularly for immunotherapy drugs, is patients whose cancers are involved with Epstein-Barr virus infection. This is about 9% of stomach cancers. And these patients also may be more sensitive to immunotherapy drugs. Next slide. So I've outlined here what are the treatment implications of genomic profiling in gastric cancer. As I said earlier, in the genomically unstable cancers, that's about 50% of stomach cancers, we find these receptor-associated tyrosine kinase pathways, and HER2 is the most important. And HER2 is a success story. We'll talk about the drugs that target HER2. Microsatellite instability, it's important to test for this because if your cancer has microsatellite instability, the cancer will be very responsive to immunotherapy drugs like pembrolizumab, nivolumab. These are drugs like Keytruda and Opdivo. And now actually, pembrolizumab and nivolumab, pembrolizumab in the United States is approved for stomach cancers that are MSI high that are progressing on chemotherapy. So it's important to know this because this is a very important subgroup of patients that may benefit from drugs like pembrolizumab or Keytruda. Genomically stable patients, as I said earlier, they have very few mutations and not clearly targetable. And then we mentioned earlier that this Epstein-Barr virus subgroup may also be a group that's more sensitive and responsive to drugs like pembrolizumab and nivolumab. Next slide. So HER2 is a clear success story in gastric cancer. However, it's not breast cancer. Trastuzumab or Herceptin is approved to treat patients who are HER2 positive. And again, we determine this either from genomic profiling or we can do immunohistochemistry testing for HER2. Trastuzumab does improve survival when added to chemotherapy. And if we look to the right of the slide, you can see that blue survival curve. The red line is patients getting chemotherapy plus trastuzumab, and the blue line is patients getting chemotherapy alone. Based on a survival improvement, patients with HER2 positive stomach cancer, when they start chemotherapy with a treatment like Folfox, if you're HER2 positive, you should get the addition of trastuzumab or Herceptin as part of chemotherapy. Unfortunately, however, other HER2 targeted drugs were not successful in this space. Lapatinib, which is a drug approved in HER2 positive breast cancer, was combined with chemotherapy in gastric cancer and showed no difference in survival compared to chemotherapy alone. And the most important recent study, which was also a negative trial, pertuzumab is another drug used in breast cancer, and the combination of pertuzumab and trastuzumab, or Perjeta and Herceptin, combination of HER2 drugs is superior in breast cancer. However, in gastric cancer, adding pertuzumab did not improve outcome compared to standard trastuzumab chemotherapy alone, a very disappointing result. So as my point is that gastric cancer is not breast cancer. Right now, the only approved drug that we have to treat HER2-positive patients is trastuzumab or Herceptin. Next slide. So what about anti-angiogenesis agents? These are drugs that starve the blood supply to the cancer. The approved drug that we have for stomach cancer is a drug called ramucirumab or Cyramza. This targets the VEGF receptor, which mediates blood vessel growth. It stimulates blood vessel growth and blood supply growth to cancers. Ramucirumab inhibits that pathway. Ramucirumab is now approved to treat stomach cancer. There were 2 positive studies of ramucirumab in stomach cancer. One was the REGARD trial, and the other was the RAINBOW trial, which I've indicated on the slide here. Once patients have tumor growing on first-line FOLFOX, if we look at ramucirumab alone versus just medical care, you can see on the right that top survival curve. Even ramucirumab by itself improved patient survival compared to medical care alone. But more importantly, the combination of Taxol and ramucirumab second line, if you look at that second survival curve, the combination of Taxol and ramucirumab was superior to Taxol alone. So the standard secondary chemotherapy now for patients with stomach cancer is to combine ramucirumab with Taxol. However, the last part of this slide, the very bottom, if we look at giving ramucirumab with initial chemotherapy, what if we give ramucirumab with your first chemotherapy in stomach cancer? If we look at the right, we don't see any survival difference for first initial chemotherapy, whether patients got chemotherapy alone or chemotherapy plus ramucirumab, and this was recently published in the RAINFALL trial. Next slide. I want to mention 2 anti-angiogenesis agents that are ongoing in clinical trials in the United States. These are drugs called tyrosine kinase inhibitors, which are oral drugs that inhibit the angiogenesis pathways. Apatinib targets this VEGF receptor, which is an angiogenesis receptor, and there was a trial in China which showed that this drug improved survival as a third or fourth line treatment compared to medical care alone. And you can see on the right a survival advantage. The blue line is patients getting apatinib, and the lower line is patients getting supportive care alone. Based on this, there is an ongoing trial in the United States comparing apatinib versus supportive care alone when patients have progressed on most conventional chemotherapies. The other drug that is in ongoing trials is regorafenib. This targets that same pathway, the VEGF receptor. Again, it's an angiogenesis inhibitor that may block blood vessel growth in cancers. And there was a limited phase 2 trial that did suggest some prolongation, prevention of cancer progression with regorafenib compared to supportive care alone. And if you look at the curve on the right, there also was a suggestion potentially of a modest survival benefit for regorafenib over medical care alone. So also regorafenib now is the subject of an ongoing randomized clinical trial in the United States. Again, patients' tumors have progressed on all conventional chemotherapies, and they get treated with regorafenib or supportive medical care. There is a lot of interest in combining regorafenib with other drugs. I don't have time to talk about it today, but I think we're going to see more studies of regorafenib combined with drugs like Keytruda or Opdivo, pembrolizumab, or nivolumab, because there may be some additive benefit when we add regorafenib to immunotherapy drugs. But this is going to be the subject of ongoing early phase clinical trials. Next slide. Another important pathway, and I mention this because there are ongoing clinical trials in the United States, is a molecule in the cancer called Claudin 18.1. It turns out that this protein is highly expressed in stomach cancers. Probably 70 to 80% of stomach cancers express this protein on the surface of the stomach cancer. Next slide. This protein is targeted by an antibody called Zolbetuximab. Zolbetuximab binds to this protein on the surface of the stomach cancer. So this Zolbetuximab targets the Claudin 18.2 protein, and it's thought that Zolbetuximab may stimulate an immune response and may potentially add benefit when it's combined with chemotherapy. So there was an early phase clinical trial, the FAST trial, which combined Zolbetuximab with chemotherapy in gastric cancer. Next slide. And if you look at the left, this is a survival curve. Patients who got Zolbetuximab had a significant improvement in survival compared to chemotherapy alone. And on the right side of the panel, if patients had very high expression, if you test the cancer for this Claudin 18.2, and if it was very strongly expressed, we had almost a doubling of survival in patients getting Zolbetuximab plus chemotherapy compared to chemotherapy alone. So based on this, there are ongoing trials in the United States. I've listed the 3 trials that are ongoing. The Illustro trial is looking at Zolbetuximab either by itself in patients with advanced gastric cancer or combining it with FOLFOX. More important for most patients nationally, however, is the trial of Zolbetuximab combined with chemotherapy, and there are 2 trials ongoing in the United States. One is FOLFOX with or without Zolbetuximab, and the other is capecitabine oxaliplatin with or without Zolbetuximab. These are the Spotlight and GLOW trials. Patients are eligible for this study if the cancer tests positive for expression of the 18.2 Claudin protein. So there are a number of centers in the United States that have this trial open. It's for untreated patients, and the drug is promising and certainly an option for patients if they have access to a center that's offering this clinical trial. Next slide. Another pathway that is identified from genomic sequencing is the FGF pathway. The FGF receptor is one of the receptor kinase pathways that's overexpressed in stomach cancer. We can look for this marker in cancers by many different measures, including looking at amplification of the gene, looking for gene rearrangements or activating mutations. There was a drug from AstraZeneca called AZD4547. This was an oral tyrosine kinase inhibitor that targeted this pathway. It had mixed results. Although initially it looked like some patients might respond to this drug if they had amplification of the FGF pathway, a more recent study compared it head-to-head to Taxol chemotherapy, and even in patients that had overexpression of the pathway, there was not a clear benefit. So the tyrosine kinase inhibitor is not moving forward. However, there is an antibody that targets the FGF receptor called bemarituzumab. This is a blocking antibody that attacks this receptor, and there was a very encouraging response to this drug in patients that overexpressed the FGF receptor. So based on this, there is an ongoing trial called the FIGHT trial of FOLFOX plus or minus bemarituzumab in patients that have FGF receptor either activation or gene overexpression. Another national and international clinical trial in patients that have this pathway overexpressed in their cancer. Next slide. I just want to mention, before I talk about immunotherapy, what we call bispecific or other monoclonal antibodies. There's a very interesting drug called margetuximab, which is being studied in HER2-positive patients. This is a modification of the Herceptin or trastuzumab antibody, where it's combined with another molecule that may stimulate immune response. There is an ongoing trial combining margetuximab with pembrolizumab in HER2-positive stomach and breast cancers with promising preliminary data, particularly in breast cancer, and we await the results of this ongoing early phase trial. If it is positive, it may move to a larger randomized trial in HER2-positive patients. The other HER2 drug that we should keep on our radar is a drug called DS8201. This is another modification of the Herceptin molecule. Herceptin or trastuzumab is actually linked together with a chemotherapy drug. The chemotherapy drug is what we call a topo-1 inhibitor. A topo-1 inhibitor is similar to drugs like irinotecan. So what happens is the drug, this DS-8201, binds to the surface of the cancer cell if it's HER2 positive, and then delivers the chemotherapy drug like a stealth bomb into the tumor. You can see a very impressive 43% response in an early phase trial, and based on this, there is now an ongoing trial of DS-8201 in HER2 positive resistant stomach cancers, comparing it to chemotherapy alone. Another antibody I'll mention briefly is a CEA, a conjugate antibody, which also appears to have promising activity combined with immunotherapy, but there's been a lot of severe side effects from this drug, but it still is in early clinical trial development. Next slide. So I'm going to spend the last part of the lecture talking about immunotherapy drugs. Obviously, we're all interested and hopeful about the benefits of these drugs. What I'm going to focus on is drugs that block the PD-1 pathway. If we look at the right side of this cartoon here, on the left side we have the T cell interacting, that's your immune cell interacting with the tumor cell on the right. The tumor cell expresses proteins on the surface that may activate what we call the PD-1 receptor on a T cell. If the tumor cell activates the PD-1 receptor on the T cell, it can actually kill off the T cell, so it suppresses your immune response. Drugs like pembrolizumab and nivolumab block this interaction. They prevent the tumor cell from killing off the T cell. So what happens is that the active T cell can then respond to the cancer cell and potentially mount an immune response. And anti-PD-1 and anti-PD-L1 drugs are the most promising class of immunotherapy drugs that we have, including drugs that now have approval. Next slide. So this slide summarizes the recent data for immunotherapy drugs in gastric cancer. For anti-PD-1 drugs, again, these are drugs that block the ability of the tumor cell to kill off your T cells, so your T cells survive and they mount an immune response against the cancer. Pembrolizumab, which targets the PD-1 pathway, is now approved by the FDA, as we said earlier, to treat MSI-high stomach cancers. So if your tumor tests MSI high and you're not responding to chemotherapy, you have the option of getting pembrolizumab. The other patients for whom pembrolizumab is approved is if your cancer tests positive for a marker called PD-L1. If your PD-L1 is positive on your cancer and you are resisting conventional chemotherapy, you have the option of getting pembrolizumab as a later treatment. This is less relevant to patients in the United States, but a similar drug, nivolumab or Opdivo, has already been approved in Japan for resistant stomach cancer. This trial showed a benefit for nivolumab independent of whether or not you were PD-L1 positive or negative. However, I'm going to mention some disappointing results recently. Pembrolizumab was recently compared head-to-head to Taxol or paclitaxel, second-line chemotherapy in PD-L1 positive cancers. And this trial, Keynote-61, did not show that pembrolizumab was superior to chemotherapy alone. So chemotherapy still seems to be equivalent to immunotherapy, and we would use pembrolizumab as a third-line treatment. The other trial I'm going to discuss more in length, because everybody wants to know whether giving Keytruda or pembrolizumab up front, is it better to combine it with chemotherapy as initial treatment? Is it better than chemotherapy alone? And unfortunately, the answer is no, and we'll talk about this. Next slide. So this is the nivolumab study from Japan. Nivolumab was looked as a late-line treatment in stomach cancer patients who were resisting conventional chemotherapy. Next slide. Again, this was a randomized trial. Patients whose tumor was progressing on conventional chemotherapy were assigned to treatment with nivolumab or placebo with best supportive care. Next slide. And you can clearly see that survival was improved with nivolumab. The blue curve resulted in a significant improvement in survival at a year for nivolumab compared to supportive care alone. Next slide. And if we look at the top of this table in terms of response rate, the very first line, you can see about 11% of patients actually responded to nivolumab. Next slide. So in the United States, pembrolizumab is now approved in PD-L1 positive stomach cancers who are resisting chemotherapy. And this approval was based on Keynote 59, which was a large trial. Over 250 patients with resistant stomach cancer were treated with pembrolizumab. Next slide. So the main focus of this trial was or more than 250 patients that had chemotherapy-resistant stomach cancer. Patients were entered on the trial whether or not their cancer tested positive for PD-L1. Next slide. In addition to MSI high status, remember I told you earlier, MSI high status identifies patients who will respond to pembrolizumab. PD-L1 is the other candidate marker for identifying patients who may benefit from pembrolizumab. PD-L1 can be tested. The pathologist can stain the tissue, and you can see on the right that brown coloration indicates that the tissue is positive for the presence of PD-L1. We now use a score called CPS, which combines not only the staining in the tumor, but also in the tissue surrounding the tumor. Next slide. So overall, in the 259 patients treated, there was about a 12% response. Now, this sounds very similar to the nivolumab that I showed you earlier, which was an 11% response. Next slide. But responses were mainly in the patients who were PD-L1 positive. If you look at the left side of the table under overall response rate, ORR, it was 16% for PD-L1 positive and only 6% for PD-L1 negative. Based on these data, the FDA approved pembrolizumab to treat stomach cancers who are PD-L1 positive. Next slide. But even more impressive were the MSI high patients. This is a rare subset. You can see that only 4% of the patients treated on this trial were MSI high, but the 7 patients that were treated, 60% of them had a major response to pembrolizumab. So MSI, a clear marker of benefit for pembrolizumab, but also PD-L1 needs to be tested for as well, now that pembrolizumab is approved for these 2 groups of patients. Next slide. I'm just going to briefly talk about Keynote 61, which was pembrolizumab versus Taxol as a second-line treatment. Next slide. These were patients whose tumor was growing on initial 5-FU platinum chemotherapy, and patients were assigned to get second-line Taxol or pembrolizumab. Next slide. Although pembrolizumab was not inferior, it was not superior to Taxol. You can see the survival curves here. The green was pembrolizumab. So beyond a year, there was a late benefit for pembrolizumab, but early on in the first 6 months to a year, pembrolizumab looked very similar to chemotherapy. It was not better. Next slide. So this looks at the PD-L1 score and how it impacted on outcome. So at the very left side, these are survival curves. If your cancer was PD-L1 negative, you can see that Taxol was clearly better than pembrolizumab. So we generally, in most patients, will not give pembrolizumab to PD-L1 negative patients, and this trial showed it was inferior to chemotherapy. The middle curve, these are PD-L1 1% or higher. You can see that pembrolizumab looked similar to chemotherapy, but it wasn't better. And then on the very far right of the curve, these are patients that had 10% or higher expression of PD-L1. Here, there's a more robust later improvement for pembrolizumab, suggesting maybe this is a subset that has a greater benefit for pembrolizumab than patients that are PD-L1 1% positive. Next slide. Responses were similar for Taxol and pembrolizumab, about 14 to 15%. But if you respond to pembrolizumab, you can see on the right, the green curve, that indicates that you had a much more durable benefit from pembrolizumab compared to chemotherapy if you did actually respond. Next slide. And then again, I always include the MSI high patients. Look at this survival in patients that got pembrolizumab. The average survival time wasn't even reached. So for MSI high cancers as a secondary treatment, pembrolizumab was clearly superior to Taxol. And again, the drug is approved as a secondary treatment in MSI high patients, and a much, much higher remission rate, nearly 50%, compared to only about 15 to 16% for chemotherapy alone. Next slide. So right now, the approved indication for pembrolizumab is as a third or fourth line treatment in PD-L1 positive cancers, and as a secondary treatment, a second line treatment in patients resisting chemotherapy that are MSI high. So this was a key study presented a few months ago at the ASCO meeting in Chicago. This was a trial we were all waiting for, in which we're now giving pembrolizumab or Keytruda as initial treatment combined with chemotherapy. These are the three treatment arms on the trial. This was a 700 plus patient trial in which patients, as their initial treatment, they all had to be PD-L1 positive, at least 1%. Patients were assigned to get pembrolizumab alone, pembrolizumab plus chemotherapy, or chemotherapy alone. Next slide. So if we look at the comparison of chemotherapy alone versus chemotherapy plus pembrolizumab on the next slide, a very disappointing result. You can see that the survival is the same for chemotherapy alone or chemotherapy plus pembrolizumab. So this provides a clear argument that we should not currently use pembrolizumab as initial treatment in combination with chemotherapy. It's no better than chemotherapy alone. Next slide. Even if you have a higher expression of PD-L1, if you're 10% or higher, there still was no survival benefit for using pembrolizumab up front. Next slide. This looks at progression on treatment, and again, no benefits for adding pembrolizumab to chemotherapy, no difference up to a year. There is a late benefit, because we know that pembrolizumab helps a subset of patients later, but it doesn't help patients early. So this reinforces that pembrolizumab or Keytruda should be used later and not earlier. Next slide. So what about pembrolizumab by itself as initial treatment versus chemotherapy? Next slide. So in all patients, this is PD-L1 positive 1% or higher, survival was not better for pembrolizumab versus chemotherapy. And what worries me here, this is a survival curve. If we look at the left side of the curve, survival was actually inferior for the first year for pembrolizumab. So for the first year of treatment, chemotherapy offers a better chance of survival from the cancer versus pembrolizumab. There seems to be a late benefit for pembrolizumab later, but that will be at the cost of inferior outcome initially. Next slide. This is a similar curve for the high PD-L1 patients, 10% or higher. Again, there is a late benefit. Pembrolizumab does work after a year, but early on, there is inferior survival with pembrolizumab alone. Next slide. And then, again, we have to look at, who's actually benefiting from pembrolizumab. These are people who are getting pembrolizumab as initial treatment and the tumor is progressing. And you can see whether you're PD-L1 1% or 10%, you have a very high chance of your tumor growing early on pembrolizumab. Chemotherapy appears to be still a better initial option, and probably reservation for pembrolizumab as later treatment. Next slide. So where does this leave us? This is my summary slide. I will mention there are ongoing trials of immunotherapy in initial treatment. Another trial that we're waiting for results from, which is completed, is nivolumab or Opdivo. There is a trial recently completed of FOLFOX plus FOLFOX alone versus FOLFOX plus nivolumab as initial treatment in stomach cancer. Obviously, the results with pembrolizumab were negative, so we're concerned that nivolumab plus FOLFOX will not be any better, but we have to see what the results show. The other trial that's ongoing is in HER2-positive patients, combining Herceptin, chemotherapy, and pembrolizumab as initial treatment compared to chemotherapy alone. That's an ongoing trial which has not yet been completed. So I think to summarize our overview of clinical trials and progress today, for patients undergoing surgery, the standard of care now in the United States is pre- and post-operative chemotherapy with the FLOT chemotherapy regimen, and there is no clear benefit for adding radiation. In more advanced stage 4 metastatic disease, 2-drug chemotherapy is preferred, and most patients in the United States are now getting FOLFOX as initial treatment. If we look at anti-angiogenesis agents, ramucirumab plus Taxol or paclitaxel is now the standard secondary chemotherapy after FOLFOX, and two other drugs, ipatinib and regorafenib, are in ongoing randomized trials in the United States in late-line treatment. We now have a new chemotherapy drug approved for gastric cancer, TAS-102. This is now approved as third or fourth-line treatment in resistant stomach cancer. Genomic profiling is now standard in stage 4 disease. This identifies targetable populations of stomach cancer patients. The two most important groups are the the RTK amplification or the genomically unstable patients. These are the HER2 positive patients. And then other important subgroup is the MSI high patients. These are patients who can get pembrolizumab immunotherapy as second-line treatment with a high degree of effectiveness. Other pathways that are under investigation in their ongoing trials include the FGF receptor pathway, which is being looked at with the bemarituzumab drug, and Claudin 18.2, which is zolbetuximab plus chemotherapy as initial treatment. For immunotherapy drugs, pembrolizumab is now approved for our patients who are MSI high or PD-L1 positive. However, pembrolizumab is not superior to chemotherapy in the second line, and combining pembrolizumab with initial chemotherapy does not improve outcome compared to chemotherapy alone. So these drugs are best used now in later line treatment. And there are ongoing early phase trials of combining immunotherapy drugs with other agents and ongoing randomized trials including nivolumab plus chemotherapy and pembrolizumab plus chemotherapy in HER2 positive patients. We'll wrap up the talk there and see if we have any time for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ilson, for sharing with us today. We did receive one question, and the question that came through is, what if HER2 results come as indeterminate?
Well, they're really not indeterminate. So typically, we didn't get into this, but the first test that's typically done for HER2 is the immunohistochemistry. The pathologist stains the tissue. So we classify, if it's 0, it's negative. If HER2 is what we call 1+, it's negative. Equivocal would be 2+ on the staining. Positive would be 3+. So if you're 3+ on HER2, you're HER2 positive. If you're 0 or 1, you're negative. 2+ is equivocal. In that situation, then we would rely on the genomic testing and look for HER2 gene amplification. If you're HER2 2+ and your HER2 is gene amplified, then you're not equivocal. If you're HER2 equivocal 2+ and you're not gene amplified, you're HER2 negative. So the equivocal patients would be the 2+ patients, and in that situation, you would do the measure of the gene amplification, and that would determine whether or not you're positive or negative.
Wonderful. Thank you again for joining us today, Dr. Ilson, and sharing your expertise as always. Again, this webinar was brought to you by Debbie's Dream Foundation, Curing Stomach Cancer. The recorded version of this and past webinars can be found in the lecture library on our website. We'd like to thank our sponsors again, Genentech, Lilly Oncology, Merck, and Taiho Oncology for providing funding to make this webinar possible. And just as a reminder, we do have all of our upcoming events. You can check them out as well on our website. And thank you again to all of our listeners. This concludes today's presentation. Please be on the lookout for information about upcoming webinars for the rest of the year. And to view any of our recorded webinars, please visit our lecture library and search by the topic you're interested in. We'd also love to hear from you and love for your feedback, questions, and thoughts. So please make sure to take the survey that is sent to you once the webinar concludes. And for any questions or suggested topics for future webinars, you can send your comments to programs@debbiesdream.org. And of course, for more information, you can always visit our website, www.debbiesdream.org. Again, this concludes today's presentation, and we want to thank you so much for tuning in, and have a great day.